All right, Rabbosai, good morning. Let us begin. So begin by thanking our sponsors for the Daf, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Shvat, to thank the Elbaum Mishpacha for dedicating all the Shiurim and Drushas this month in memory of Yaakov Koppel, Ben Avram Menachem. Right? Is Avram here? Ben Avram Menachem. Okay, it's not on the sheet. Okay, we hope that by his children, Avron, Sean, Judah Elbaum, his loving wife, Shirley Elbaum, we hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, may his neshama have an aliyah and the family a nechama. And to thank Bracha Strimber for dedicating all of the shiurim and drushos this month in memory of her husband Avi, Avram ben Kalman Eliezer Halevi, on the occasion of his 9th yard site. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the neshama will have an aliyah and the family a nechama. And with that, let us begin. We have a beautiful daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Nun Zayin 57. Baruch Hashem, we made some good progress despite the slow start in the daf, getting bogged down with Baruch Hashem. Not bogged down. That was the Chas Shalom. Getting lost in some of the beautiful details. We are picking up this morning at the bottom of Nun Vav on days 56b at the 2 dots. The Nostin Pe'el Yarek. So remember again, our Mishnah discussed 6 things that the people of Yericho did, and 3 of them, to be clear, the rabbis were not happy with any of them, but 3 of them they objected to, 3 of them they did not object to. Or I should reverse the order. 3 of them they did not object to, 3 of them they objected to. We're now up to the last item on that list, which is that the people of Yericho went ahead and gave payah from vegetables. So remember, again, we spoke about this in yesterday's daf. What's the problem? It sounds like such a wonderful thing. Remember, vegetables are not subject to payah. Payah means leaving, again, the corner of the fields for the poor. So leaving payah from vegetables, you're not obligated to do so, seems to be like such an incredible charitable act. But of course, remember, as we saw in Rashi in yesterday's daf, it was problematic. Why? Because halacha l'maisa, essentially, payah is tax exempt, right? Payah, you don't have to separate out shumas and maisrus. But if you take something and designate it as payah when it's not really in the payah family, that means that effectively what you're giving to the aniyim is tevel. In other words, the aniyim, if you, let's remember again, you can make anything you want hefker, and if you want to go ahead and give your property to the poor, that is certainly your prerogative. But halacha l'maisa, if it's not payah, that means that when the poor take it, they must separate out shumas and maisrus. The problem, of course, was the poor didn't know this. They assumed payah is payah. If you're living in as payah, it's truma meiser exempt, and so they were taking and effectively eating tevel. So the Gemara goes out to the Gemara says, this is a Mefurish Mishnah. Right? The halachos of payah are an explicit Mishnah. What's the Mishnah? Klal lamru b'payah. This is the general, called guiding light principle when it comes to payah. Kol shu ochel, number 1, you have to be food. Right? Payah only comes from an item that's food. V'nishmar. Nishmar means it could be stored. It could be stored. V'gidulo min haaretz, and it grows from the ground. U'likitasu ka'achos, and it's harvested at once. U'machniso l'kiyum. And ultimately, again, you could go ahead and store it for long amounts of time. So the Gemara says, Chai b'payah. So again, halacha l'maisa, if a food item satisfies all of these criteria, then under those circumstances, it is subject to payah. So the Gemara says, each of these comes to exclude something. Kol shu ochel, has to be food, number 1. That's prat l'sviche sotis v'kota. So we'll say this refers, remember Svichim we had in the sugya regarding Shvius, regarding Shemitah, right? The prohibition to eat Svichin aftergrowths out of fear that you may come to go and plant something. So what does it mean when it says it has to be a food? This comes to exclude the aftergrowths. Satis, I will say, translates as safflower, and kotza translates as woad, W-O-A-D. These are items that grow v'nishmar, and ultimately, again, it's something that's guarded. I shouldn't say stored, because stored is really the end. Something that's guarded, what does that refer to? Prat lahefker. This comes to exclude a hefker item. So we'll say something that is hefker, ultimately, again, cannot be made into payah. V'gidula min haaretz, and ultimately something that grows on the ground. Prat lekiminu pitrios. This comes to exclude mushrooms and truffles, which, although they grow attached to the ground, ultimately, again, do not halachically grow from the ground. And as the example, it's harvested all at once. Prat leteinim. This comes to exclude figs. So we'll say figs, interestingly enough, are not harvested at once, even on the same tree. different figs mature at different times. So the Gemara says, "Umachniso likiyum," and only an item that can be stored, ultimately is subject to peah. Prat liyarek. Both say this excludes vegetables, because vegetables can't be stored, right? Vegetables rot. So we'll say it's interesting, kind of, when you put all of these together, kind of what comes out is, the only thing that's really subject to pay is really things like standing grain, because they're harvested at once, they're stored for a long time, people don't make it, you can make it hefker, but I think that something someone would normally guard, so on and so forth. But again, the point that Gemara is making over here is, why would the people of Yericho be leaving payah from vegetables? It's an explicit Mishnah that vegetables don't fit peah criteria. This is fascinating. What are you talking about over here? The leaves of turnips. The leaves of turnips. Then I will say a little bit of interesting insight into turnips over here. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi liftos ali halefes machnisin oselikim al yedei ha'imos. Then I will say, here's what's interesting. Everyone agrees that technically speaking, turnips could satisfy the criteria for peah. You say to yourself, for 1 second, that's not true. It can't satisfy the last criteria, which is machnisa l'kiyum. Saying that a store, you can't store turnips, they will rot. You can store turnips. How do you store turnips? You pickle them. If you were to pickle turnips, you could go ahead and store them for a prolonged amount of time. So we'll say, you'll say you could do that with any vegetable. Okay, that's a kasha. But again, we're not on the sugya of peah right now, so we're not going to deal with that. But I will say, but watch this. So the Gemara says as follows. What are we dealing with over here? We're dealing with the leaves on the tops of turnips. We'll call them turnip leaves, for lack of a better term, which are the leafy part that grows at the top of the vegetable. Umachniso l'kiyum al yedei davar acher. So we'll say, interestingly enough, if you were to pickle the turnips, often I guess they would be pickled with the leaves on top of it. So the shaila is, now the leaves, technically speaking, are they subject to peah or not? Well, you're pickling the leaves, which therefore makes them quote-unquote storable, but lamaisa, they're only being pickled because of the primary turnip plant. Meaning it's a subsidiary, a secondary item. It's not being stored for itself, it's only being stored for something else. So the Gemara says, this is machlokes. Mar savar machniso l'kiyum ayidei davar achar shmei kiyum. So one opinion says that when you store one item by dint of another, right? When you store one item, not because you really want it, but it's being stored because it's attached to the primary item, that secondary item is still called a quote-unquote stored item, and therefore is subject to peah. We'll say that's what the people of Yericho felt. The people of Yericho felt that the leaves of the turnip plant could be utilized as peah, because halacha lamaisa, they were stored together with the turnip. They were only there because they're just that happen to be attached to the turnip. They're not being saved or stored because actively anyone wanted them. It doesn't make a difference. Ultimately, the people of Yericho held, machniso l'kiyum, when you store something, al yedei davar acher, by dint of it being attached to something else, that is still called a stored item, and therefore can be subject to peah. Umar Sabar versus the Rabbanan the rabbis at the time who felt, lo shmei kiyum, that when you store one item by dint of another, but you're only storing the second item not because you really want it, but just because it's attached to the primary item, that's not called a quote-unquote stored item, and therefore it is not subject to peah. So what I say, interestingly enough, where the Gemara seems to be explaining over here, is the machlokus in the people of Yericho and the Rabbanan was not about leaving peah from vegetables in general. Everyone knows you can't generally leave peah from vegetables. It was a very specific case of turnip leaves. So the people of Yericho felt the leaves themselves are subject to peah because halacha l'maisa, they're stored. They're not really stored because you want them. They're stored because they're attached to the turnip. So they felt, nevertheless, that makes it a stored item. It checks all of the boxes by peah, and therefore halacha l'maisa is subject to peah. The Rabbanan again felt, no. The leaves are not called stored. They just happen to be stored because they're attached to the turnip, but they're not subject to peah. That was the machlokes. Good. So the Gemara kind of expounds on this a little bit. Ten Rabbanan. A very interesting brayso. Verishona how you know stim peah lelefes ulikruv. In the beginning, they used to go ahead and give peah from lefes. Lefes, as we saw before, is turnips. Kruv is cabbage. Rabbi Yossi Omer af lekaflut. Rabbi Yossi said even leeks. Leeks were also, they used to leave peah from leeks. V'tanya idach, another brayso said, Hayunosnin peah lelefes v'lekaflut. Another brisa says they used to give peah ultimately again from lefes, turnips, and kaflut leeks, but of course this one leaves out cabbage. Rabbi Shimon Omer afla kruv, and Rabbi Shimon adds in cabbage, top of Nun Zayin. The Gemara says, are you telling me, Nema Tlosa Tanai Havu? Are there three different Tanaim who comment on the discussion regarding vegetables and peah? To which the Gemara says, lo, Trei Tanai Havi. Ultimately, again, there are only two Tanoim. The Tanakama Rab Shimon Hainu Rabbi Yossi. The Tanakama Rabbi Shimon is really the same position, Rabbi Yossi. The Tanakama Rabbi Yossi Hainu Rabbi Shimon. And the Tanakama Rabbi Yossi is Rabbi Shimon, is also Rabbi Shimon, I should say. Umay Af, and what does he mean when he says Af? When he says Af Lekruv, Akamaisa. He's simply going ahead and adding on the previous statement. Good. So again, so what we begin to see, just interesting. So first of all, what we quoted over here before, I will say, every once in a while, and by the way, there are still Daf Yomi notebooks if anyone wants, because it's good to take notes. I will say, but again, every once in a while you come along these yisodos. So for example, what we just learned by peah is a very important yisod. It's a very important principle that halacha l'maisa, in order to go ahead and be subject to peah, ultimately you have to satisfy these criteria. You have to be ochol, you have to be food. Nishmar, something ultimately again that is not hefker. Gidula min haaretz, you grow from the ground. Likitaso ka'achas, harvested at once. And machniso l'kiyum, something that is potentially stored. Those are the five criteria ultimately for peah. I want to point out, those are uncontested. Five criteria for peah. Now, what's contested is, so therefore again, based on that, we say vegetables are not subject to peah. But now what you begin to see is, now there's a discussion, but one second, you can store vegetables. Oh, well, if you can't store vegetables, technically, then they could be some subject to peah. That doesn't really seem to be so contested either. The machlokes is with the leafy part of those stored vegetables. Do we view the leaves as stored items, or do we just simply view them as nothing, as like dirt that's attached to the plant itself? That was the machlokes, the Rabbanon and Anshe Yericho. Anshe Yericho felt the leaves were significant, therefore again subject to peah, just like the actual vegetable. The Rabbanon felt it was just like leaving dirt on the vegetable, totally insignificant, not subject to peah. I will say an incredible story. Tan Rabbanon, Ben Bahayon, whoever this is, Rashi says over here, Ben Bahayon, Shem Aviv Bahayon. Okay, so Rashi just says, okay, his father's name was Bahayan. They will say, now the reason, why is Rashi come? I mean, isn't that a little bit obvious? We'll say sometimes you have these individuals, who are identified by the Gemara, and they call them Ben someone, but the someone is actually not their father. But instead, again, the someone is a description. For example, we'll say, again, when the Gemara describes the three wealthiest men of Yerushalayim, so there's Kalba Savua, Nakdimon ben Gurion, and Ben Tzitzis HaKesses. So Ben Tzitzis HaKesses, his father's name wasn't Tzitzis HaKesses, right? Ben Tzitzis HaKesses means, remember, he was so wealthy, the Gemara says, that his tzitzis never dragged on the ground. He used to walk on silken cushions. So his tzitzis would drag against the kesses. So we'll say, see here, Rashi's pointing out over here that, by the way, Ben Bayan, his father's name was Bayan. That was that. Okay, so we'll say, listen to this. Tana Banan, Ben Bahayon, Nasan Pe'el Yarek. Watch this. So the son of Bahayon, he gave peah from vegetables. So he left a corner of his vegetable field for the poor to take. Watch this. His father came home and saw what the son did. And what happened? He saw that the paupers were standing there. Son Bohayon comes home. Obviously, his son did not consult with him with what he was doing. So ultimately, the father sees that the paupers are there, holding a whole bunch of vegetables by the entrance of the garden. Amar Lahem. So Bahayon, now the father says to the paupers, Banai, hashlichu ma'alechem, do me a favor. Drop the vegetables, drop it, right? Drop the vegetables. Va'ani nosin lechem kiflayim b'me'oser. And I will give you twice as much tithed produce. It will say, remember again. So what Bahayan was concerned about was, these aniyim, they think they're taking payah. If it's payah, it's exempt from Shumas and Maisrus. They're going to take it home, and it turns out they're going to consume Tevel. So he makes them an incredible offer. Drop what you have with you right now, and I will give you twice as much tithe produce. Lo mipnei she'eni tzara. Don't think this is because I'm cheap, right? And ultimately, again, don't think it's because I'm cheap. Rather, ela mipnei she'amru chachamim ein nosnin peah liyarek. But rather, it's because the chachamim said we don't give peah from vegetables. So the Gemara says, "Lama leila memra lehu lo mipnei she'eni tzara." Now, we'll say, remember, what was the offer, right? The offer was, drop the vegetables, I'll give you twice as much tithe produce. And then he says, by the way, I'm not doing this because I'm cheap. I will say, obviously he's not cheap. He's offering them twice as much. Why did he have to say that? So the Gemara says, Lama lehu lememr lehu lo mipnei she'eni tzara. To which the Gemara says, Kihechi dilo lemru tachuye kamad chilan. Because they both say, the aniyah might have thought like this. Oh, sure, right, sure. You're going to give us twice as much tithe produce. We know what's going on over here. What is Bohayan trying to get us to do? What is he trying to do? He's trying just to get us to go out and drop the vegetables. And once we drop the vegetables, what's going to happen? He's going to gather it up. He's going to chase us out of here, and we're going to be left with nothing. Therefore, Bahayan felt that ultimately, again, it was necessary for him to explain to them, I'm not doing this because I want the vegetables back. I'm not doing this because I'm cheap. I'm doing this because you are taking untithed produce. And ultimately, again, this is not real payah. So therefore, put it down. I'll give you twice as much tithe produce. Both say, I was very struck by this Gemara. Very struck by this Gemara, that if you notice the way that Bohayon goes ahead and talks to the Aniyim, is he calls them Banai. He calls them my sons. Now, both say, just to be clear, the Aniyim were doing something wrong, right? Remember, again, obviously, it's Bohayon's son who has responsibility because he made the vegetables, into payah. But Lamaisa, the Aniyim were also doing something wrong in taking vegetables. Also, remember again, it's a Mefurish Mishnah that you can't take vegetables as payah. And amazingly enough, Bohayon refers to them as his sons. So I'll tell you something amazing. The Lubavitcher Rebbe, Sechet Tzadik Livracha, makes an amazing observation in the past week's parsha. The Torah says by the whole episode, I have to thank Reb Larry Ziffer for allowing me to learn the Rebbe's Torah every week. So I'll say, so amazingly enough, so the pasuk says by the Mata, right? We know the whole story. We spoke about this Shabbos morning. By the Mata, right? Moshe, they come with the whole miracle of the Mata turns into the snake, and then the Torah says, Vayivla mata Aaron es matosam. Ultimately, again, the mata, the staff of Aaron, swallowed up the staff of the Khartoum of Paro's sorcerers. So Rashi HaKodesh says, Vayivla mata Aaron, me'acher shechazra v'nase mata bala es kulan. That there was a miracle. What was the miracle? Say, it wasn't the snake of Aaron that swallowed up the snake of the Khartoum. Rather, what happened was the staff turned back into a staff and swallowed up all of the other staffs as well. So ask the Rebbe, why? Why? I was supposed to say, it's like a miracle in a miracle. It was already a miracle that the staff turned into a snake. But okay, so let the snake of Moshe and Aaron swallow up the snake of the Khartoumim. It turns back into a staff, and the staff swallow up the other staff. So listen to what the Rebbe says. The Rebbe says there are times in life where you have to swallow someone. What does that mean? There are times in life where you have to tell someone they're wrong. You have to tell someone they're wrong. Yeah, you have to give Musar. Right? Both say, we live today in society. So we're often taught to think, live and let live. Everyone's right. Everyone's entitled to their version of truth. It's not true. There is truth and there's sheker. There's emes, there's sheker. There's right, there's wrong. There's moral, there's immoral. Of course, is there gray in this world? 1,000%. But sometimes you have to tell someone, you're wrong. You're wrong. But when you tell someone you're wrong, what the Rebbe calls, you swallow them, which means you negate their version of the truth because they are wrong. You don't swallow them as a snake, right? You don't swallow them in a caustic, abrasive way. But you swallow them, you negate their version of truth. You give them musar in a calm, loving fashion. That's why the mata turned back into a mata. It was the mata of Aaron that swallowed up the matos of the Khartoumim. Because sometimes when you have to tell someone they're wrong, you don't do it as a serpent going in and swallowing up other serpents, but you do it as a mata. And remember the mata, like we saw yesterday, the mata of Moshe has the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu on it. It's the 72 letter. You use it mata, swallowing up the other mata. So we'll say, it struck me, I happened to see this idea yesterday, it struck me over here, you see Bahayon, we'll say, can you imagine the scene? You walk into your field, your kid, while you were away for a couple of hours, decided to go out and mark off a whole corner of the field. Everybody and their brother is there, gathering up vegetables, right? And you walk in, I think most of us will react a little bit differently. What does Bahayan say? Banai, my children. I both say, if you want your words to be heard, especially when you're trying to promote your version of truth, when you have to give musar, the way to convey emes is benachos, is being a mata, not being a serpent. An incredible Gemara. Bose we go weiter. Tan Rabbanan. So Bose Berishona hayu manichin oros kachim belishkas beis hapara. Bose another incredible Maisa. It's incredible. In the beginning, they used to leave the oros kachim. So remember again, Rashi points out over here that halacha, if you look at Rashi, oros kachim, or ola v'chataos v'ashamos v'karbanos sibor shemischalkim oros kachi hakadashim l'kohanim. So remember again, certain types of karbanos, the hide became the possession of the Kohen. The hide became the possession of the Kohen, right? So remember again, so just we spoke about this many times before. So the Kohanim were split up into 54 mishmoros, right? And each mishmar, so 54 shifts. Each mishmar was comprised of multiple bate avos, which are Kohanic families. Each Beis Av, the hope was that they would get a day to serve in the Beis HaMikdash. So Rabbi say, so what would they do? So now you offered up a whole bunch of karbanos in a day. So you have all of the hides. What would they do with the hides? And remember, those hides, Rabbi say, that's where Kohanim got a lot of parnasa from. Besides the meat of the karbanos, they got the hides, of course, truma. So Rash to Gemara says, but in the beginning, they used to go out and place the hides, the oros kachim, in Beis HaParva, which was a chamber in the Beis HaMikdash le'erev. And every evening, they would divide up the hides amongst the family who served in the Beis HaMikdash that day. And I will say, by the way, there's no guarantee, right? Because remember again, everything depends on the volume of that particular day. So Tuesday might be a slow day, Thursday might be a more packed day. But whatever it was, at the end of the day, they would divide up the hides. Watch what happened. Vayubale zroos notlin osam bezroa. But there were some powerful Kohanim who would take more than their share. They would take more than their share. So we'll say, so first of all, it's just an incredible thing. We'll say, no one is immune. No one is immune to the pull of money. Right? It's an incredible, this is happening in the Beis HaMikdash. So Balizro, which means they were more powerful, whether it means physically powerful, or more influential Kohanim, who would take more than their share. So what happened? Hiskinu shemechalkin also me Erev Shabbos, da'asyon kulo mishmoros, v'shaklin bahadadi. So they made a new takana. The new takana is, we're not going to divide up the hides every day. We're going to divide up the hides at the end of the week. We'll say, what's the mile of dividing up the hides at the end of the week? All the families, remember again, the end of the week is when the shifts would change. So gather everybody together on Friday. Rashi says over here, La'erev Shabbos, Dekulei Mishmara Tehave Hasav V'lo Yanichu L'Bal Yisrael Litol B'Zra. See, I will say, if you're dividing the hides up every day, it's only one Kohanic family that's there. It's easy for some Kohanim maybe to muscle their way through. But the assumption was that halacha l'maaseh, if you're dividing up the hides at the end of the week, all of the Kohanic families are there. No one could really muscle their way into taking more than their share. That was the assumption. So what happened? Va'adayin hayu gidolei kahuna noten osa b'zra. We'll say, listen to this. Still, what ended up happening? The gidolei kahuna, which I will say is not a compliment, right? The gidolei kahuna is not the chashav, meaning the stronger Kohanim were still taking more than their share. Rashi says, Sarin shebahem, the more chashav ones was taking more than their share. So we'll say, so what happened? This is incredible. Amdu bailim v'kdishu l'shamayim. So we'll say, this is actually very interesting. The Kohanim came together and they said, you know what? No one gets hides. if this is what's going to happen, that literally, again, there's an abuse of power, and some kind of going to take more than their share, then no one gets anything. And they decided ultimately, again, to consecrate the hides to the Beis HaMikdash. All the hides were consecrated to the Beis HaMikdash. So the Gemara says, so Amdu Bailam Rash is Kol Kohanim Mishmaros Yachad V'Kedusha B'Tegabais. So we'll say, so watch this. Amru. So they said, Lo Hayu Yamim Mu'atim. So we'll say, so now, obviously, this was a windfall for the Beis HaMikdash. Because suddenly, again, the Beis HaMikdash has an incredible infusion of money. Because suddenly, again, remember, all of those hides that were once Kohanic property, now become the property of the Beis HaMikdash. Listen to the Gemara said, Lo Hayu Yamim Mu'atim. Ad shechipu es hahechal kula b'tablao shel zav. Shein ama ko'ovei dinar zav. Both say, watch this. So it was a short time later that what happened? They literally covered the entire Beis HaMikdash in gold. Both say, where did these funds come from? From the hides, the sale of the hides. There was so much money that came in from the sale of the hides that were the property of the Kohanim, but the Kohanim that were matched to the Beis HaMikdash, that they covered the entire Heichal. They covered the entire, we'll call it the Beis HaMikdash proper structure, in gold. Or we'll say literally again in tableaus. If you can imagine in I guess we'll call it golden tiles. Golden tiles that were an amma by amma with the thickness of a dinar. Ula regal, both listen to this, and on the regalim, when all the Jews would come to the Beis HaMikdash, hayimekaflin osa, they would take off the tiles, umanichin osa gav maila b'harabayis, and they would put it on the ramp up to harabayis, kideshu oli regalim roin, shemelachtam noah, ve'ein ba dalam. So that the people would see, the pilgrims would see, or come to the Beis HaMikdash, how perfect the craftsmanship was, and there was no blemish. Shabbos says, isn't this beautiful? They would take off, it's first of all, it's just an incredible story about how the desire for money could easily corrupt. And could easily corrupt even pious people, and could easily corrupt even in the most pious places. We all know this, right? I think there's no one amongst us who doesn't like money. Everybody likes money, right? Again, unless you're mamish, like a tzaddik who's mufka from Olam Haza. But I think most of us like money. I think most of us like money a lot. But Lamaisa, again, you see how sometimes, again, the ability, when you see the opportunity to get more, how sometimes that could bring out the worst of people, right? The notion that the Kohanim are quarreling amongst themselves and stronger Kohanim are taking the portion from weaker Kohanim is heartbreaking, to the point where they saw the only solution was be makdish everything. The beautiful part, of course, was it served ultimately, again, for the benefit of the Beis HaMikdash. Now, I'll tell you something interesting. Let me see if I could quickly pull up the Rambam here. I will. The Rambam. Let me see if I could pull it up over here. If I could pull it up quickly, I will. Mishnah Torah, Maisa Karbonis. I'm sorry. Okay, I can't pull it up. But I would say anyway, so the Rambam happens to paskin, this was a Horah Shah. This is Horah Shah. In other words, this system did not remain in place. Instead of say what system did remain in place was as follows. That halacha l'maisa, what they ended up doing was as follows. In the beginning, they used to divide up the hides every day. They stopped that system, and hide division took place on Fridays. That system did remain in place. Apparently, this story that we're seeing over here, where they decided to consecrate the hides, that was not the Olam Va'ed. That I don't know historically when this happened or for how long it actually went on for. But I will just tell you that if you look up in the Rambam, Maisa Karbanos Perek Hey Halacha Chaf, you will see that the Rambam codifies it that they would divide up the hides Friday. We'll say, good. So that's the halacha l'maisa. Good. We'll say, let's go back to a little bit. Tana Abishal. So we'll say, once we're talking about strong arm tactics, the Gemara brings up another story. Tana Abishal taught, Koro shel shikma hayu b'Yericho. We'll say there were these beautiful trunks of sycamore trees in Yericho. V'hayu balis ros, notlin osa bizroa. And yet some very strong people who used their influence to take that which was not theirs. Amdu Bailim, so ultimately the owners got up and they said, Vekdishum Lashamayim. And ultimately, again, the owners said, you know what, if we're not going to have it, this is inappropriate, they made it hektish. They made the trunks of the sycamore trees in Yericho hegdish. Aleim v'al kiyotze bohem. About these type of people, and they both say these type of people refers to people who take things by force, who exploit the weaknesses of others for their own advancement, their own gain. About people like this, Amar Abishal ben Batnis, Mishum Abi Yosef ben Chanin. So we'll say Abishal ben Batnis, you say the name of Abi Yosef ben Chanin. We'll say, listen to this. Now we'll say this is an incredible, overwhelming Gemara. Incredible Gemara. We'll say, speaking about people who exploit their position and exploit their power to take advantage of the weak. Oili mi beis baitos, oili mi alasan. Woe to me from the house of baitos, and woe to me again from alasan. Rashi says over here, baitos. Rashi says, kohen gadol haya, v'chein kula. In fact, we're going to see all of the people mentioned over here in the next couple of lines were all kohanim gidolim. But I will say what happened over here was as follows. Kohanim Gidolim had a lot of power. And unfortunately, sometimes the Kohanim Gidolim themselves were good people, but they didn't always surround themselves with the right people. And you had many people on their support staff, we'll call it, who took advantage of the power of the office of the Kohen Gadol to exploit the weak and to enrich themselves. So you see again, Abba Yosef. Abishal ben Matnis, in the name of Abba Yosef. Oili mi beis baitos, woe to me from the house of baitos. Oili mi Allah. So say on Allah, Rashi says over here is makalo sehen, is a staff. Kimolo ba'ala v'lo b'romach. So we'll say really it translates actually as a mace. So we'll say as a M-A-C-E. So we'll say, so ultimately again, so the saying over here, baitos was the Kohen Gadol. And literally again, his family, his support staff would beat people up for their money. They beat people up and extract wealth from them. Oili beis Chanin, woe to me from the house of Chanin. Oili min lichishasan, and woe to me again from their whispering. Now we'll say, so apparently again, now remember, Chanin again was also one of the Kohanim Gidolim, and what used to happen is his support staff used to purposely give bad counsel to take advantage of people. So the idea over here would be about saying, no, you give someone bad advice, you really should sell off that piece of real estate. It's not going to be worth anything. The market's going to tank. And what happened? They listen to your advice because you're a high profile individual. They sell, and sure enough, what happens? You buy it at a discount. They would take it, so they wouldn't physically abuse people, but they would give bad advice to entrap people. Woe to me from the house of Kasrus, and woe to me again from their quills, that they would write detrimental letters, maligning the reputations of people to their own advantage. Woe to me from the house of Yishmael ben Piachi, woe to me from their fists. So we'll say literally again, the people in Yishmael ben Piachi, again, he was a Kohen Gadol, these individuals would literally, the support staff would beat people up to take advantage of their wealth. Shehim Kohanim Gidolim. I will say all of the people, all of the names here, these were all Kohanim Gidolim during the second Beis HaMikdash. All Kohanim Gidolim. So I will say, and I want to be clear, some of them, as we're going to see, were actually good people. Some of them were good people. But unfortunately, again, their support staff were not. So, Shem Kohanim Gidolim, Ubeneihem Gizbarin, their sons were the Gizbar. I will say this Gizbar was effectively, again, the temple treasurer. The Chazanim and their sons-in-law were Amar Kolin. We'll say Amar Kolin is actually a contraction of Amar Kol. People whose word determines everything. They were essentially the Beis HaMikdash CFO. Right, so if the Gizbar is the treasurer, so ultimately the Amar Kolin is the CFO. So we'll say it's actually very interesting over here, because you see already it's a little bit fishy. Why is it a little bit fishy? Because what happens? You have the Kohen Gadol, and suddenly again it's amazing, he becomes Kohen Gadol, and all his sons and sons-in-law, whatever, this is not right, his sons and sons-in-law suddenly again have positions of prominence. So the Gemara says, and ultimately again his servants, their servants would go and hit the people with staffs. So we'll say, so unfortunately, again, this type of what's the word? Corruption was unfortunate. I'm sorry. But it's nepotism and corruption, because it's both. We'll say again. Remember, nepotism. It says the right way. Nepotism doesn't have to be bad if it happens to be the people who you appoint are good for the positions. In other words, if you happen to go ahead and give your close relatives positions and they do a good job, fantastic. If they don't do a good job, that's corruption. We'll say, so it's not the nepotism in and of itself that's problematic, it's the corruption that was really problematic. Unfortunate. So we'll say the Gemara goes weiter with this. Second wide line, Nun Zayin Amud Aleph. Turn Rabbanon. Arba tzavachos tzavcha azara. We'll say the azara, which means the courtyard of the Beis Hamikdash, but the Beis Hamikdash itself cried out 4 times. First time he said, Rishona, su'u mikan b'nei Eli shetimu echel Hashem. The first time the Beis Hamikdash cried out was when it called out and cried out and told the children of Eli, get out. I will say now, remember again, the story with Eli is in Shmuel Aleph, which was in the Mishkan. It wasn't, of course, in the Beis Hamikdash. So I will say, remember again, the Navi says that the sons of Eli, Chafni and Pinchas, slept with women in the Mishkan. Then Rabbi said there's a big machlokes exactly what that means. Did that mean that they literally committed adultery? Or again, some of them are first saying that what they used to do is the women would come to offer their karbanos, and what would happen? Chafni and Pinchas would say, sorry, we close at 5. Right? We close at 5, or we close at 4, whenever they chose to close at 4. And they would cause the women to have to stay over that night, being separate from their husbands. See, either way, it was an abuse of power. It was an abuse of power. To the point of also that the Azara, the Mishkan, cried out, get out. Of course, the children of Eli, unfortunately, again, die. Right? They're killed in battle. They're killed by the Plishtim when they took the Aron out to battle. But ultimately, again, the first time the Beis Hamikdash cried out was saying the children of Eli, get out. V'otzavcha, semi kan Yisachar ish kfar bar koi. The other time he cried out was, get out Yisachar, who was from the village of Bar Koi. He was a Kohen Gadol. Why did the Beis Hamikdash cry out for him to get out? Shemechabit es atzmo, umechalol kodshei Shemaim, because he honored himself, but he desecrated the karbanos of Hashem. Listen to this. This Kohen Gadol Yisachar from the village of Bar Koi, what would he do when he did the avodah? He would wrap his hands in silk. Now remember again, sounds very beautiful. There's only one problem. It's called what? A chatzitza. You can't do the avodah like that. The avodah must be done with a bare hand. Shabbos say he wrapped his hands in silk as a form of self-aggrandizement. They say he was saying, look how chashuv I am. See, he was mechabed himself, but he demeaned the avodah. So ultimately, the Beis Hamikdash cried out and said, Yisach, we're going to tell Yisachar ish bar koi, get out. V'otzavcha azara. Ultimately, the Beis Hamikdash cried out another time as well, but this time was a good cry. Su'u sharma shechem, v'ikanes Yishmael ben Piachi. Talmido shel Pinchas, v'yishamish pekuna gidola. Both say, but then there were times the Beis Hamikdash cried out, Su'u sharma shechem, open the gates. For who? Yishmael ben Piachi, because he was a Talmud of Pinchas, which Rabbi said is not literal, of course, but it means he was a Kanoi, like Pinchas, and let him come in ultimately again, and Rashi says over Yishmael ben Piachi, kasher haya. So I'll say, remember again, by the way, it's interesting, this is what I mentioned to you before. Yishmael ben Piachi was quoted before as someone who had a very corrupt staff. So I will say they were examples of individuals who themselves were tzaddikim, but unfortunately, again, surrounded themselves by the wrong people. V'otzavcha azara, the Beis Hamikdash cried out another time. I always said this was a good cry. Susham Roshechem, v'ikanis Yochanan ben Narboi, Talmido shel Pinkoi. I said this is a great story. The Beis Hamikdash also cried out and said, allow in Yochanan ben Narboi. So both say he was another Kohen Gadol, who was also a tzaddik. He was the Talmud of shel Pinkoi. Now both say, we don't know who Pinkoi is. Interestingly enough, the Ben Yehoyada posits that Pinchai was also Pinchas. It's calling these Kohanim Gidolim the Talmidim of Pinchas because they were big tzaddikim, just like Pinchas was a Kanoi, was a zealot, was a tzaddik. It's calling these Kohanim Gidolim tzaddikim as well. Now watch this. And let Yochanan ben Arboi, who was the Kohen Gadol, who was ultimately again a great tzaddik as well, let him come into the Beis Hamikdash and ultimately again fill his stomach from the Kabbalah. So we'll say, get ready for this. Amru alav al Yochanan ben Arboi. They said about Yochanan ben Arboi, we'll say, who again, Chazal are regarding as an incredible tzaddik, Shaya ochel gimel meos agolim. He used to eat 300 egels, right? 300 calves. V'shoseh gimel meos garbe yayin. He would drink 300 barrels of wine. Va'ochel arboim sa'ah gozlos bikinuach sudin. Then he would eat 40 sa'ah of young pigeons for dessert. Wow. Amru. So they said, listen to what it says, this is wild. Amru. Kol yomav shel Yochanan ben Arboi lo nimtza no sar b'mikdash. This is great. All the days that Yochanan ben Arboi was the Kohen Gadol, there was no sar. Right? So we'll say, what's no sar? No sar is the leftover sacrificial meat. All this, we'll say, obviously, this is hyperbolic, right? What does this mean? We'll say, so again, the Ben Yoyada comments, he says what it means is, Yochanan ben Arboi had an incredible love for the karbanos and an incredible respect for the karbanos. That Rabbi say doesn't literally mean he consumed this amount. Why was there no sar all of the days? Because he encouraged the Kohanim to eat the sacrificial meat. Let's not leave anything over. There's such kedusha, such opportunity, such a privilege to consume this. We'll say when a Kohen consumes karbanos, it's me'al shulchan gavoa. It's from the table of the Ribono Shalom. So we'll say it doesn't mean he ate this much. Because remember again, when you hear this much, what does it sound like when you eat this much? When you eat this, what does it sound like? Gluttonous. So obviously, Chazal aren't extolling gluttony. Gluttony is an avera. It's a violation of Kedoshim to you. But rather what it's saying is, he took his job so seriously and he understood the privilege to eat Me'al Shulchan Gavoa. Incredible. Rabbi say, get ready for this. This is how the parak ends. My salke baby, Yisachar Ishkar Farbar. Remember again, the Gemara quoted, so I just want to point out, so the Beis HaMikdash cried out 4 times, right? 2 times was for people to get out, 2 times was for people to come in. The first time for people to get out was the sons of Eli. The second time the Beis HaMikdash cried out, please get out, was for this individual, Yisachar ish kfar barkoi. Right? Yisachar from the village of Barkoi. Get out. Get out. So it says the Gemara, so remember, what did he do wrong? He used to wrap his hands with silk when he would do the avodah. So he would build himself up while diminishing the importance of the avodah. So what happened to him? The Gemara says, what happened to Yochanan, to Yisachar ish kfar barkai? Both said, get ready. My salka baby Yisachar ish kfar barkai. Whatever happened to him? So Amri Malko Malkisavi Yasvi. One time the king and the queen were sitting and having a discussion. Shabbos Rashi points out which king and queen? Malchi Beis Chashmonoi. So Rabbi say, remember again, this is when these are by the Chashmonaim. So remember again, this is very important. As I told you, this is all Second Temple era. And not only that, this is in the times of the Chashmonaim. So remember again, the Chashmonaim were Kohanim. They were Kohanim. They defeated the Syrian Greeks, and then they took the monarchy for themselves. It's a machlokes Rambam and Ramban as to whether or not the Chashmonaim did the right thing by taking the monarchy. Some say they absolutely did the right thing because they had to stabilize the leadership of Klal Yisrael. Others explain no, it was a terrible, terrible mistake. There is a reason why religious leadership and political leadership are separate, right? Remember again, political leadership comes from Yehuda. Or I should say, called governmental leadership comes from Yehuda. Religious leadership comes from Levi. Even though, again, they work in concert, because also remember again, in a Jewish model, we don't have democracy, we don't have any of this. We have a theocracy, right? We have a monarchy that is run based on the tenets of religion. But Lamaisa, there's still a separation. There's Yehuda. Lo Yasser Shevet mi Yehuda. Ultimately, again, really, Kuhuna Levi, from Levi. So you see, by the way, that unfortunately, the Chashmonai monarchy became very corrupt. As time went on, it became very corrupt. So the point over here is, we don't know who this king and queen are, but Rashi goes out of its way to point out that this is the Hasmonean monarchy. Now, maybe it was in the beginning when it was still good. I don't know. I don't know historically when Yisachar ish Kfar Bar Koi lived. But here's what's happening. So this is a Jewish king and queen. They're having a discussion. What's the discussion? So let's listen to this. So Malka Amar Gadjoyoy. So we'll say they're having a culinary discussion or culinary debate. The king said, a gedi. Rabbi said, what's a gedi? A gedi is a young goat. The meat of a young goat is the best. Umalkisa amra imrayoy. So the queen said, no, the meat of a young lamb is the best. So they're having a machlokes. We'll say, so right, Shalom Bayis problem. Right, they're having a machlokes. King says young goat is the best. Queen says young lamb is the best. So who's going to decide this machlokes between the king and the queen? So the king has a great idea. Amru, man muchach. Who could decide this? Kohen Gadol. The kamasik karbanos kol yoma. Who would know best than the Kohen Gadol? Because we also remember again, what does the Kohen Gadol do all day? at least in the eyes of the king and the queen, he eats meat. And he eats sometimes goat meat, he eats lamb meat, so he could tell us ultimately, again, what is best. So what happened? Asaihu. So who do they call him? Who was the Kohen Gadol? None other than Yisachar Ish Kfar Bar Koi. So they call him in. Asaihu. So Yisachar, come and decide. Amud Beis. That's an Amud Beis. That's an Amud Beis. So what happens? So they call him in. Achvi biyadeh. So both say, now watch what happens. Yochanan Kohen Gadol walks. Yisachar Ish Kfar Bar Koi. I'm just going to call him Yisachar. Yisachar Kohen Gadol walks in, and we'll see Achvi biyadeh. Rashi says, he does like, we'll see, like when someone walks in, like a dismissive gesture, like this is what you're wasting my time with. Such a foolish question. It's obvious. If the meat of a young goat was really best, yasik litmida, then it should be brought for the carbon tamid. Instead of Osai, what is brought for the carbon tamid each and every day? Keves, right? What's brought for the day is lamb. So the fact that young lamb is brought for the carbon tamid, which is the daily communal offering, brought twice every day, 365 days a year, that tells us that what? That is clearly the best kind of meat. And I will say, now that's a fine answer. But often in life we know, it's not what you say, but rather what? It's how you say it. The problem over here is, I will say, what happened? Yisachar Ish Kfar Bar Kai walked in, and he was dismissive to who? Really to who? To the king. So first of all, the gaiva. We'll say, you know what's amazing about gaiva? What's amazing about gaiva is how gaiva allows you to become so self-absorbed that you lose even self-awareness. You want to be a Baal Gaiva. You're talking to the king. And by the way, you're about to tell the king, you're wrong. Be a chacham. But that's the destructive nature of gaiva. When you're a Baal Gaiva, you don't even realize who you're talking to. Or you don't even realize what context it is, because you're so self-absorbed that I simply cannot see. So keep saying that. Yisachar Ish Kfar Bar Koi walks in, and he walks in like, this is what you're wasting my time with. Come on, everyone knows, every tippish knows that young lamb is better than young goat. What's the shaila? After all, the carbon tamid is offered up with a lamb. So I'll say, so what happens? Amar Malka. So the king was very offended. So v'lo havile imsa damalchasa. This guy walks in here and he has no reverence. He has no respect for the king. Nifsok liyamine. I hereby order that his right hand be cut off. His right hand be cut off. In other words, what does this have to do? Because everyone knew that Yisach Ish Kfar Bar Koi, how did he do the avoda? With silk wrapped around his hand. He's so important. Every Kohen Gadol until him always did it barehanded, but he's so chashuv that he wears silk on his hand. We're going to go ahead and cut off his right hand. So watch the story. Yair Shochad. So Yisachar Ish Kfar Bar Koi bribed the hand cutter. I don't know what you call him, whatever you call him, like the executioner, the hand cutter. So he bribed him. How did he bribe him? Upaske l'smala. He bribed the guy. Listen, don't cut off my right hand. Cut off my left hand. Shama Malka. The king heard about the bribe, and now the king was even angrier. You come in here, you act with chutzpah. I order a punishment for your right hand to be cut off. You bribe the cutter, right, the royal cutter, and you go ahead and you bribe him to cut off your left hand. So now, paske liyamine. Ultimately, again, I order that your right hand be cut off. Amar Rav Yosef. So we'll say, so Yisachar Ish Kfar Bar Koi emerges from this story, Nebach, with no hands. Amar Rav Yosef, Baruch Rachmana Da'ashkele Yisachar Ish Kfar Bar Koi Lemitrafase Minei Bahai Alma. Blessed is HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who extracted punishment from Yisachar Ish Kfar Bar Koi in this world. To which the Gemara says, Amar Rav Ashi, Yisachar ish kfar bar koi lo tana masnisin. By the way, Rabbi Osai, I just want to point out, the Gemara now goes on to say, Rav Ashi says, Yisachar ish kfar bar koi was so quick to say that obviously the young lamb is better because what the carbon tamid comes from. Rav Ashi says that Yisachar clearly didn't know the Mishnah. He didn't know the Mishnah. What does the Mishnah say? Distan, Rabbi Shimon Omer, kvasim kodmin le'izim b'chol makom. Generally in karbanos, lamb is always offered before goats. You might have thought because its lamb is better than goat. Talmud Lomar im keves yavi karbano. Melamed sheshnehem shkulim ge'echad. Rabbi Osei just happy to see that the Torah says that you should bring a lamb over the goat, but not because lamb is better than goat, just because, whatever the reason, the Torah gives a precedence to the lamb over the goat, but not because the meat of the lamb is any better than the meat of the goat. Ravina says, Afilu mikranami lokara. Truth is, Yisachar ish kfar bar koi didn't even know the pasuk. Right? Forget about a Mishnah. He didn't even know a pasuk. Tichsiv, im keves, im eis. The pasuk says, if you want to bring a keves, you want to bring an eis, you want to bring a lamb, you want to bring a goat. Either way, iboy keves laisi, iboy eis laisi. So Rabbi Osai, again, you see the destructive power of gaiva. That what happens with gaiva, Rabbi Osai. So gaiva allows a person to become so self-absorbed that they don't even know who they're talking to. Gaiva becomes a person allows her to become so self-absorbed that I forget the Mishnah, I forget a pasuk, or not even I don't even feel the need to learn everything. Because at the end of the day, I know everything. Now, Rabbi Osai, the Ben Yehoyada asks an interesting question. He says, obviously, Yisachar ish kfar bar koi was punished. But Rabbi Osai, why was he punished with the loss of both hands? In other words, at the end of the day, B'pashtos, where did he wear the silk? What hand did he wear the silk on? The right hand, because remember again, Rabbi Osai, you do avoda with the right hand. So B'pashtos, he wore silk with his right hand. So why was he punished with the loss of both hands? Both hands. So the Ben Yehoyada says something amazing. Because Rabbi Osai, how do you get the silk on the right hand? You wrap it with the left hand. So that's where the Ben Yehoyada ends. But I was thinking about this. We've spoken about this many times. Rabbi Soloveitchik discusses this in Ala Tshuva, and he says so beautifully that in the world of sin, there's two parts to sin. There's chet, there's sin itself, and there's derech chotim. There's the pathway to sin. And those are two very different things. Because I think about an avera that I've committed. So there's the maisa avera I've done, but averas usually just don't materialize. There's a whole number of smaller events that ultimately lead to that particular maisa avera. And the Rav exposits that the derech to tshuva is to identify those smaller steps, to identify those smaller moments, and ultimately, again, go ahead and stop them from occurring. That's tshuva. Tshuva is not just the cessation of hate. Tshuva is ultimately, again, the cessation of derech chotim as well. And that's the incredible symbolism over here. The symbolism is the act of Yisachar ish kfar bar koi, of actually wearing the silk on his right hand. That's the hate. That's the hate. But the left hand putting the silk on the right hand, that's the derech chotim. And ultimately you see that Yisachar ish kfar bar koi is held responsible for both. He's held responsible ultimately again for the chait itself, but for the left hand, which ultimately facilitated, which enabled the chait as well, he's held responsible for that. And I both say that's the secret to successful spiritual living. Not just to avoid sin, but to be honest with myself. What are the steps that lead me up to chait? And how could I nip it in the bud? Because if I'm just trying to stop chait, I'm already a little too late. But if I could identify the steps that lead me up to avera, that lead me up to wrongdoing, and I could stop myself in my tracks, forgetting it even in those steps, that's ultimately the pathway to spiritual success. I will say, Yasher Koyach Hamjin Allah, Makom Shenagu. I will say, just want to point out, because it's a Sunday, and maybe all the football games were last night, right? There are no football games today? Are there football games today? No, there might be. All right. I'm sure everybody had their fill of how much football can one person watch. So I just want to point out over here, if you look, you'll notice a whole bunch of Rashi on the bottom over here. So so this actually is a fascinating piece. What you're going to see below are all the halachos of Pesach Rishon. The first Pesach that we observed in Mitzrayim was dramatically different than what we call Pesach Doros. All of those distinctions are included in this paragraph below. Even if you can't get it done in one day, it happens to be a fascinating distinction. All right, both sides. We'll stop over here. Mazel tov on the conclusion of the parak. Tomorrow morning, brand new parak. Shkoya. Everybody, nice to see you. Baruch haba.